turns out once you add these real-world features that I've taken out, it strengthens the result. But again, I wanted to provide a very sharp analytical result, which is why I focused on this. But let me conclude by thinking about some broader issues this raises about central banking and where we lie in terms of our development in terms of the theory of central banking. And this is based on a report called Rethinking Central Bank that I was part of, and there are a number of distinguished economists here. We were basically, it's a group of practitioners and academics. We just got together and decided that since many of us in this group were talking about how central banks in the wake of the financial crisis needed to rethink their models, needed to rethink their ways of doing business, but nobody had really tied some of this stuff together. So this report was basically an attempt to think about the way forward for central banks. It's probably somewhat immodest to think about it as rethinking central banking, although it did get a lot of traction in many central banks. And many of the issues we raised there are about how financial regulation needs to be meshed with macroeconomic policies and so on. But central banks, as we point out in the report, are coming under additional threats. For instance, sovereign debt is rising, especially in the advanced economies, and one of our colleagues in this report, Carmen Reinhardt, has been very forcefully arguing that this is leading to financial repression of a sort. We see this happening very visibly in Europe, and to some extent in many other advanced economies as well, that with debt levels rising, banks are in a sense being forced to take on more and more of this debt. This used to be a problem in the emerging markets, and many thinkers in the advanced economies have criticized the settings in emerging markets where banks are seen as being subject to financial repression because they are forced to buy government bonds. Well, voila, we see that happening in the advanced economies as well. Now, emerging market central banks are not only dealing with these legacy problems, they also have to deal with exchange rate issues because for open economies like Brazil, India, even China, you cannot completely afford to ignore the exchange rate because it does have a very important effect on the manufacturing sector and ultimately on job growth, especially growth in terms of high-paying jobs. And now you have this added complication of food, fuel, and other commodity price increases. What's a central bank to do? Now, the problem here again is that central banks really shouldn't be responding to commodity price increases because many of these constraints are supply constraints. Again, taking India as an example, the central bank is faced with the problem of having to deal with a very high public debt burden, which constrains monetary policy, and the fact that food price increases are feeding through very rapidly into overall price increases because the distribution system is not very good. Now, it's a terrible idea for a central bank to deal with this, and India is suffering the consequences because interest rates are having to be kept high. That is hurting the industrial sector. Brazil is facing similar tensions, and essentially they have no choice but to respond. But what I have argued is basically that in this setting, once you start thinking about financial frictions, what seems like the wrong thing to do may in fact be the only practical and feasible thing for a central bank to do. And essentially, what I've done with this model that I presented is basically provide some analytical grounding for central banks to do basically what they have to do. So let me conclude by a picture that I used in a paper of mine. I'm unduly proud of this picture. I call it the art of central banking. It basically shows what a difficult balance central banks always had to strike, but how that balance has become even more complicated. On the one hand, you now have central banks trying to manage multiple objectives and multiple instruments. Now again, classical theory, and I myself have written about this, argued that central banks have one instrument of policy interest rate. You should focus on just one objective, low and stable inflation. In the post-crisis world, there is a lot of talk about two policy instruments, the policy interest rate and regulatory policy, and trying to deal with financial stability as well as low and stable inflation. But the reality that emerging market central banks in particular, but also advanced economy central banks now face, is that they have a whole lot of objectives without that many instruments. But on top of that, the problem is the more objectives you take on, even if you have more instruments, that compromises your independence. So this is extraordinarily delicate balance between the balance between objectives and instruments on the one hand and independence on the other hand. And that, of course, requires you to deal with this issue of credibility as well as transparency. And in the report I referred to earlier, one thing we argue is that central banks, whether they like it or not, whether it proves to be optimal from the point of view of a theoretical model or not, may be in a different world right now where they are stuck with a whole lot of different mandates, and increased transparency might be the only way to get out of this fix where they could otherwise lose their independence. So let me conclude by saying that I'm glad I'm an academic and not a central banker. Thank you. Oh. I'm happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
So I understand that constraint, that credit constraint of people that have to eat and work in agriculture is an important feature of your model. But since most of their income is spent on food, even if they have no access whatsoever to financial assets, they can still store food. So that's one way to transfer income from today to tomorrow. And so that's relaxing some of your assumptions, I guess, and I would be interested to know how would that affect the results.
So Hoa has asked a very important question. What happens if households have access to a storage technology? In fact, I'll generalize your question to say, what if all households had access to a storage technology of some sort? That certainly weakens the results. But again, food is a perishable item. And once you think about commodities like food that don't have a long life in terms of storage, most of the results go through. Once you introduce a storage technology that is long-lasting, or once you introduce physical capital into the model, that weakens the results. But it turns out that the baseline results I showed you do show a very significant increase in welfare. And so long as you have enough of a commodity where the storage technology doesn't have a very long life, the results go through. Another extension of your question is, what if there is money? Because even if farm households don't have access to a storage technology where they can put aside bananas and expect them not to rot, although in Brazil I guess we should talk about mangoes, great mangoes here by the way. If you think about money as being an alternative, it is correct that money gives you an alternative storage technology. But there, in fact, it turns out there is an alternative channel that bites, because if you have money in the model, then headline inflation is eating away the value of money. So in fact, then the farm households get hit even more badly, because the only technology they have is money. And that's going to get eaten away by headline inflation. So your basic point is that one has to think about these storage technologies, and you're right that they do weaken the results, but they don't make them go away. Yes.
Thank you for your talk, which was very interesting. So you say you were an academic and you are not a central banker. So let's assume now that you are a central banker. And let's assume that you are in three different situations. Firstly, you are Mr. Bernanke, and we assume that we are in the US without the horrible financial crisis, but we are just looking at very high food prices, and inflation is fairly low. So my first question is, what would you do if you were Mr. Bernanke today? And my second question is that we are looking at a very small country, let's say a country in North Africa called Tunisia, where they had this food prices a few years ago, and the government went under. So if you were the central banker there, would you have done something?
I'm glad I'm not either of these persons you mentioned. In the case of Bernanke, I think he has many other headaches on his mind right now rather than worrying about food price increases. But at a conceptual level, I think in the case of Bernanke, the big question is, what is the pass-through from food prices to overall inflation? Because the Fed does have an inflation target, but the Fed has had a tradition of looking at personal consumption expenditures. If you take the overall effect of food price increases and their effect on the PCE, it's not very great. But what is important, even in the case of the US, is the distributional effects, because the distributional effects turn out to be very significant. If you replace the households that I think of as food households with a notion of poorer households, those are the households that are going to get hit quite badly by food price increases. So there becomes an important political element to it, that if the relatively poor households are being affected, then the central bank is forced to act. In the case of the US, again, I don't think it's a pressing concern. But rather than thinking about a very small African country, let me pose this dilemma even in the case of India, where there is a very similar dilemma. The industrial production growth has been slowing down because right now the policy interest rate is quite high, and the food price increases have been driving overall CPI inflation a great deal. And again, the governor of the central bank knows that he should not be responding to this from a conceptual point of view, but he has no choice in a sense, because if you think about where central bank independence comes from, and in the case of a country like India, and the small country you're referring to, even if there is statutory independence, and there isn't, that independence hangs by a thread. So once you start losing political legitimacy, which you would if you said you don't care about food price increases because the central bank can't do anything about it and can only make things worse, then it becomes very difficult for the central bank to continue operating and maintaining its independence. So I think the very, very difficult answer that many central bank governors are being led to is that, again, as I mentioned, they are being forced to do something that conceptually they shouldn't, because in a sense monetary policy is the only viable policy instrument that can deal with this problem. So it's a very messy world. It's not a good, clean answer, but I think this is the reality that central bankers face. Yes.
We always talk about food price increasing, and most of the times in a situation of not abundance, right? How do you get the increase of the cost of food production inside of this? I mean, mainly because of fertilizers and things like this. How do you think this, for example, we talked about India, and many people from agriculture now are even committing suicide because of the costs of producing food. Then they are not really receiving more money, but other fertilizers companies are doing that.
Yeah.
And even not really Indian fertilizers companies.
Yeah, this is a huge issue, and I cannot pretend to any expertise on food policy issues, but one thing that's clear is that there needs to be a lot done on the supply side, both in terms of improving food productivity, especially in the low-income economies, and in terms of improving the distribution system. Both of these, I think, are enormous constraints in terms of what is happening. Plus, of course, you have misguided policies. I think the policies of the US, for instance, in continuing with ethanol subsidies makes very little sense from an environmental or economic point of view, and it affects food prices. So there is this combination of policies in the advanced economies, which in addition to this policy of the US, also there are enormous protectionist concerns in many of the advanced economies. So it turns out there is this curious thing about food. It is a very highly tradable commodity, but most food is produced domestically. But what happens in world markets, although it is relatively marginal, does tend to drive prices a lot. So I think the answer really has to be for government policy in the emerging market and low-income economies to deal with productivity issues and distribution issues. In India, for instance, the distribution system is a complete mess. Productivity has increased over time, but if you can't get the food over to markets, that hurts. The answer really doesn't lie with monetary policy, which is more my area of expertise. So I think a lot more needs to be done. But central bankers are being forced to deal with all of these consequences. All right. Let me stop here and turn it over to the next presenter.
Tudo bem. Primeiro, eu gostaria muito de agradecer os organizadores da conferência, o Roberto e o João Victor, e que para mim é sempre um prazer muito grande de estar aqui no Brasil e dar palestras. Now I'm going to turn to English because that's probably part of my second life before getting to my third life in Brazilian. And my first life, of course, is French. Thus, I have a hard time saying this thing. How does it work, actually? Here, okay. So this talk will be, there have been a number of talks. I can take it away. There have been a number of talks on various aspects of volatility prices. And then it's where I started to bring us a little bit backward in terms of the policy responses to volatility prices, monetary prices, and monetary policies. So I'm going to get even more one step back to another question related to some political economy considerations that can interact with price volatility and commodity price volatilities. Basically, the question I'm going to look at is a kind of a very whole-standing question in terms of the relationship between natural resources and whether or not for an economy it's a blessing or a curse. Of course, the standard sort of natural and traditional wisdom coming from economic historians and various scholars of the Industrial Revolution is that it was a blessing. Typically, the experience of the United States, England, or even other countries, which are now successfully developed, tended to suggest that actually having natural resources was one of the fundamentals that allowed us to be growing fast and getting to a high development stage. And probably according to that view, Brazil is just its way on to get to that point. Now, after the 80s, however, the presumptions changed dramatically in the literature that actually countries that were endowed with natural resources were facing a curse. And probably this started with this kind of single scatter point showing average growth rate over 2 decades from the end of the 60s to the 90s and 2000, and plotting that against resource dependence, exports of the GDP at the beginning of the period. Now, of course, if you look at a relationship like this, as an econometrician, you will say, what the mower? It doesn't mean anything because actually it's just a correlation, even if it can be a spurious correlation because there are omitted factors, you don't know anything about causality or anything like that. But that triggered basically the world literature on the analysis of the resource curse, and it started with Sachs and Warner that basically tried to make sense of that particular relationship, controlling for a bunch of factors and using the by now disgraded, but at the time very well appreciated cross-country regressions and trying to understand the relationship with resource dependence and growth. Also, this was quite consistent with a number of case studies that were done at the World Bank, at the IMF, and other places, emphasizing that when you had an oil boom or a commodity price boom, then very often you had bad policies, and you had actually really the feature of a resource curse happening, typically for countries like Nigeria, Ecuador, Trinidad and Tobago, and other countries, Zambia, for instance, for copper booms, and all those things seem to be relatively well consistent. Now, of course, if you get more into the details, then you realize that this kind of relationship that I just showed up uncovers a number of cases that are very, very diverse from each other. Actually, for each country, even if you limit yourself to developing countries, not to talk about Norway or Great Britain and other things, just to look at developing countries, you realize already that for any kind of Venezuela or Mexico, you have a Botswana or a Chile on the other side. So that basically this relationship tends to matter for some countries, but not for others, and therefore there's a lot of variety of outcomes. Now, also, probably after this first wave of the literature on the resource curse, there came up some skepticism and controversies about whether there was really a resource curse. And this is related to a number of problems, of course, with the relationship, statistical robustness, whether the sample size that you use, whether you use which kind of measure of resource that you use, resource dependence or resource abundance. Also, of course, the standard type of criticism that one has with cross-country regressions. You have omitted variables, you don't control exactly to identify the causality. A bunch of people actually started to criticize this, emphasizing that actually you had to go through better data, panel data with fixed effects and all of things like that. Although more recently, some recent studies tend to suggest that even if you do that, you still find out some kind of effect of a resource curse going through per commodity price booms. Now, I would like to say that it's fair to say that the literature shifted away from this kind of uninteresting question of what is the average effect of a resource endowment on economic performances to sort of two other questions that are sort of more interesting. The first one is explaining the diversity of those results, explaining the diversity of outcomes and mechanisms, why some resource-abundant countries are successful and others are not. And there's a literature that started to do that, emphasizing in particular the role of institutions and policies, and therefore getting to sort of the title of my talk on the political economy dimensions. Or there are papers emphasizing that actually some countries that had good institutions were successful at benefiting from the gains of the natural resources, or the countries with bad institutions were doing much less well. Some countries, actually the system, the political system itself seems to be correlated with whether or not you're getting good or bad results. You better be in a parliamentary system than in a presidentialist kind of institutional context. And of course, that policies, trade policies, might also be associated to that. Of course, there are always a lot of caveats in all those studies because this is about cross-country regressions. And even if sometimes they include some time dimension, you're never sure that you identify rightly the causality. Now, there's also kind of dimension, but still, those studies suggest that there are political economy dimensions that matter a lot for the existence or not of a natural resource curse. Now, the second trend is kind of more recent, tends to emphasize that what matters for really the impact of natural resources on economic performances is not so much the abundance or the amount of resources that you have on your ground or that you're selling outside on international markets, but it's much more the fact that those countries also are specialized in goods that have high volatility prices, that there's kind of a volatility curse, and it's going through this uncertainty generated by having natural resources that actually you could have this kind of effect. Of course, in the standard literature on growth, there are some good arguments to believe that volatility is bad for growth. Volatility generates uncertainties, and therefore it can depress investment. There's this sort of first paper in that literature by Rame and Rame showing how unexpected output volatility is negatively correlated with average growth of countries. More recently, there's a bunch of papers that suggest as well that when you are subject to nominal interest exchange rate volatility or real exchange rate volatility, that is bad for productivity growth, or that can prevent firms from investing into innovations, in particular when the country is facing financial frictions or imperfect capital markets. Now, more specifically for natural resources, there's also more recently a bunch of papers, and less recently so for the first one, that emphasizes that the volatility curse also happens because of the fact that countries have access to natural resources. The paper by Hausmann and Rigoban, for instance, tends to suggest a variant of the Dutch disease kind of phenomenon that goes through an interaction between specialization of the country into non-tradable sectors that tend to amplify the volatility of the real exchange rate subject to demand shocks on the non-tradable sector, and because of the existence of financial frictions, that also spills over, increases in interest rate, which in turn will depress investment, make the country even more specialized in non-tradable sectors and services, and therefore, at the end of the day, getting to eventually decrease in capital accumulation and a natural resource curse. Now, empirically, there have been some papers more recently that suggest that actually the channel for which natural resource curves happens is not, as I said, the average effect, but going through this volatility feature on macroeconomic performances. But those kinds of papers suggest on top of that that it might be going through fiscal volatility, namely the volatility of public expenditures or public policies on growth. And this last paper as well suggests that when you look at average growth rate of countries and you try to see how they correlate with the volatility of rents of natural resources over time, then this negative effect tends to be mitigated if you are in a good country with good institutions than if you are in a bad country with bad institutions. Again, that suggests that the connection from volatility, price volatility, to political economy, because if it goes through public policy volatility, if it goes and it is mitigated by political institutions or the type of institutions in countries endowed with, then it suggests that there might be some connections between political economic considerations, the type of policies that governments put in place, and the environment they are subject to in terms of volatility of their of resource prices. So what I want to do here in this paper and my talk is just to explore some of the connections between those political economic considerations and the volatility curves. And the political economy channel I want to emphasize here is something that has been somehow consistent with a lot of case studies, observations by people working in those countries, that when you have a natural resource boom, often it's associated with bad policies by governments. Some governments have incentives to produce some inefficient redistributive features, enlarge the public sector to such extent that it's very inefficient, and create some dysfunctionality in the behavior and the functioning of the state. Now, what I'd like to do is to see how this feature of bad economic policy generated by the possibility of rents coming up in the country interacts with price shocks, commodity price booms, and when there is also some kind of future unexpected, well, there's some uncertainty about future prices of those commodities. What are the interactions and how it fits back with political incentives and public policies. Now, the way I'm going to do that is, it's going to be a theoretical paper again, but it's going to be even more theoretical than S4 paper. There won't be any calibration. It's going to be just a bunch of collection of very simple caricature models of political economy. Political economy is a very difficult field because you have a number of complex issues that can be related with each other. So you want to simplify as much as possible, try to have caricatural models just with the hope that you unlight some channels, some incentives that feed back and allows us to have some implications for the implementation of public policies and so forth. So I'd like to start with a model which is going to be a model of political competition. There are, of course, various models of political competition you can use to illustrate my point. Some models are maybe best fitted for countries like in Africa, where you have wars, civil wars, and Zaire or places like this, where you have open conflicts. Some models are more fitted with democracies, where political competition is more framed within the context of elections or lobbying. Now, I'm going to use a very standard political economy model, which is a probabilistic voting model, where I'm going to have an incumbent politician, and this incumbent politician will face different problems. First, the first problem of any politician is to stay into power. So he's going to have to design policies to stay into power, but on top of that, this guy has access to resources, and the resources come into the budget, the public budget. So he's going to face a problem of resource extraction on top of the type of public policies he wants to design. Now, inefficient policies, inefficient redistribution, in my story, will be characterized by a feature that probably is common to many countries, and certainly in Brazil, there is some evidence that it happens. It's clientelism and patronage. That is, this incumbent guy is embedded into a kind of social network, which is clientele of people, and it brings up a system of political exchanges in order to buy out votes. Well, I'm not going to talk about the jury of the of history, but it's related to that feature, this idea that actually politicians, incumbents, can somehow affect the result of political outcomes by manipulating the voting system and giving rents and favors to their clients. Now, one way to do that, that's been emphasized by the literature, is through public employment. You give people jobs. Why is it so? Because jobs actually allows you very much more than money to solve some kind of commitment problem on both sides, of the side of the patron, the politician, and his clients. On one hand, the patron, the politician, is necessary for the client to receive the money or the favor, the job, after being elected. On the other hand, actually, as we showed with the paper with Jim Robinson, actually, it could be also satisfying the other side of the credibility issue, that the patron, actually, the incumbent politician, satisfies his promises to his clients. So I'm going to take that kind of context. And then I'm going to put into that my model, a very caricatural model of the economy, resource curves, where you're going to have some price shocks and eventually some volatility. And how that's going to affect then the perception of voters, therefore the political support they might generate for the incumbent and the challengers, therefore the incentives of the incumbent to design before that ex ante some policies that are good or bad, and eventually, through that, a channel that generates a resource curve. So that's going to be a mechanism, a political economy mechanism through which the volatility implied by commodity prices feeds in fiscal volatility that affects the behavior of voters and in turn has implications for the design of public policies by incumbent politicians that try to stay into power. Now, what are the main insights that I'm going to get from that kind of frameworks? First, if you are only looking at domestic price shocks, this is a paper that I did some time ago with Jim Robinson and Torvik, where we got a number of results. But one of the results that comes up and kind of very natural is that, of course, if a politician is concerned about being re-elected, you are naturally going to be led to have over-extraction of the resource compared to what should be the optimally efficient path of extraction of the resource, namely the hoteling rule. That is kind of very trivial because the politicians are discounting too much the future. You know that's going to benefit from the resource only if he gets elected, and that's going to be with some probability. So it's discounting too much the future, and for that reason, it's going to have a tendency, natural tendency to over-extract. What is kind of more interesting is that actually clientelism, in that case, may improve the efficiency of the extraction path. But on the other hand, will generate some distortions in terms of allocation of resources inside the economy by providing those public jobs and over-expanding the public sector of the economy to make sure that he has enough clients to be re-elected in the future. Therefore, what's going to come out from that conclusion is that resource booms might create in the development, but not so much because they generate an inefficiency in the rate of extraction of the resource, but much more because of the side effects of what politicians do with the rents and how they distort by the public policies the reallocation of resources inside the economy. Now, when you start to introduce volatility in the sense of stochastic prices in the future, then volatility basically will have two effects. The first one is that it's going to affect the political support of the incumbent, because if part of the uncertainty is passed through to the voters because politicians have only limited access to certain types of policy instruments, then risk-averse voters will tend to take that into account, and that's going to reduce the time horizon as well of the politician. On top of that, politicians themselves might be affected by the uncertainty if they are themselves risk-averse about the results or the type of rents they can receive, and therefore the value of staying of power will be also affected. Now, when those two features get together, you need to have an additional bunch of ingredients I'm going to get through in order to generate the following elements. That when the incumbent's constituency is more sensitive to the fiscal shocks generated by volatility on the public budget constraint and therefore on public policies than the rest of the population, then what you can get exactly is that higher resource volatility is going to have really bad effects. Bad effects in terms of implementation of inefficient patronage policies, more overexpanding on public sectors, crowding out of public sector investment that is productive for the private sector, magnification of over-extraction of the resource, and that's going to be more so when you are in a context where the country or the place is with weak institutions, in the sense that weak institutions, meaning by that incumbents are likely to influence more the result of the elections through those mechanisms than in good institutions. Okay? So the roadmap will be, I'm going to go through very rapidly, surveying some of the political economy models of the resource curves. It's going to be very quick. Then I'm going to present a very simple model of clientelism with some equations somehow, and price shocks. Then what happens when you start to extend that to price volatility, and then you have some extensions where you can put public investment, and then when the resource can be endogenously extracted by the decisions of the politician. And then I'm going to get to some conclusions if I have time, okay? So in terms of the survey of economic and political models of the resource curves, I'm not going to be long on this. There are nice surveys recently that have been published, or in the Journal of Economic Literature, or by Jeff Frankel from the NBER. Essentially, we have two types of stories. One, which is the one that economists know about most of the time, which is the standard kind of Dutch disease mechanism. When you have a resource, then you have a windfall of income that stimulates demand for a non-tradable sector, an over-appreciation of the real exchange rate that contracts the non-resource sector, and that has bad implications. Why bad implications? Well, to get the bad implications, you need on top of that to have some kind of externality or increasing returns to scale or dynamic learning by doing, so that actually when you have this contraction of the tradable sector, that creates lack of growth and therefore can generate a natural resource curse. That's a standard story that was told by Sachs and Warner, Krugman, and other people, okay? Now, in the political economy literature, basically, the resource curse comes from a different mechanism. Is it okay? No. All right, change of microphone. The first one is kind of models where you don't have much about institutions, political institutions. Typically, the idea there, which has been exemplified by the paper by Tornell and Lane, what's called the veracity effect. Namely, interest groups, they can invest their resources or their capital in two types of activities. Some activities that are not prone to rent seeking, that are protected but are not very profitable, and other activities where actually the demand for redistribution can be exacerbated. In that case, an increase in the productivity of that kind of second sector can generate demand for redistribution that at the end of the day imply that the after redistribution rate of return on those activities is reduced to the point that actually the country contracts. Other papers tend to emphasize that actually, well, in bad institutional contexts, entrepreneurs can face occupational choices, or they do rent-seeking and lobbying, or they are productive. And of course, a windfall of resources might induce them to do more of the entrepreneurial choice to be rent seekers than to be productive entrepreneurs, and that in turn can generate a resource curse. But again, for that, you need somewhere some negative multiplier, some externality, some increase in return to scale to make sure that the effect overcompensates first the increased value of income generated by the resource boom. Okay? Now, in terms of political economy models of the resource curves, there's of course a huge political science literature that emphasizes, for instance, what is called the rentier state. Typically, when you have access to a lot of windfall resources, then it doesn't make much sense to ask to your citizens to pay taxes. But when citizens don't pay taxes, they don't try to supervise either politicians, and therefore, in a sense, in the richer states, you have natural resources that prevent the development of good political institutions of monitoring politicians and allow for open political competition context. In that case, that again can generate, as the situation, for instance, of Saudi Arabia or the Arab Emirates. Now, a bunch of other papers went on, and I'm not going to go through them, where you have civil conflict, types of papers by Collier and Offler, very well fitted for Africa. a bunch of paper that I did myself with some co-authors on the fact that windfall of resources can distort the choices of the incumbent politician in a way that is inefficient, and of course the fact that it can generate public sector distortions for the types of policies that are implemented. So let me get now a very, very simple model that suggests how resource booms can generate distortions and therefore a possibility for resource curse. Take a very simple case where you have a two-period probabilistic voting model. To period 1 and 2, you have two politicians, A and B, the elections at the end of period 1. So this is the simplest model that you can use to illustrate my point. You have a mass of voters, a mass of guys who have normalized to 1, and there's a natural resource that has two prices, P1 and P2. Now, the resource can be extracted in period 1 or in period 2, and I'm going to assume that the more you extract today, or the faster you extract the resource today, the less actually you're going to have the resource tomorrow, but the more inefficiently actually you're going to extract the resource. So that, in a sense, it's not optimal to have everything done today. Now, given this, this resource income can be used in two different ways by politicians. Or it can be consumed as rents or indirect rents, or it can be distributed to people or to be re-elected somehow. And what I'm going to assume is that here, because of this issue of patronage and clientelism that is characterizing weak institutions, then it's going to be done through public jobs in an efficient way. And it's going to influence, therefore, the election outcomes. And suppose that you don't have taxes. You could bring tax into the picture. That's not going to change much of the issue. After elections, who wins the elections is in power and decides about the optimal policies, and there's no commitment on policies. Institutions don't allow you to commit in advance to ex post policy in terms of redistribution, except for the fact that the incumbent politicians, because of this structure of clientelism and social network embedding, is able to offer credibly something, rents to clients that it will provide after if he gets re-elected. And here, there's going to be a public job that provides a public wage, W, which, to make things, of course, interesting, is going to be larger than the productivity of that same guy outside in the private sector. Otherwise, that wouldn't make any sense. So the probability of re-election here, and I'm going to provide then a micro model that suggests why this kind of probability looks like this, is going to be increasing with the level of public jobs that my incumbent is going to provide to his clients, okay? So the problem is going to be very simple. The politician is going to maximize his expected income, taking into account the rents he can extract in the first period, here minus what he has to pay on the budget, wages of the clients, and plus the probability to be re-elected times the rents he gets in the second period. And you can look at the first order conditions. I'm not going to go through that. Just get into what is the equilibrium policies. You have two policies here. You have the patronage that the incumbent politician provides, here the extraction rate of the resource in the first period, and those two curves are downward sloping. Why is it so? Well, for the extraction curve, the more the politician provides patronage, the more likely, is going to be re-elected, and therefore the more forward-looking is going to be, and that's going to be providing him to reduce, therefore, the extraction rate today and leave it for tomorrow. And similarly, in the second period, for the patronage, the higher will be the extraction rate, the less is left for re-election, and therefore the less likely the patron wants to be re-elected and spends for patronage expenses. So that's going to give you the equilibrium policies. Now, this can be compared to the efficient extraction path, which is just no more than a very simple version of the alternating rule, where the marginal growth rate of the rent has to be equal, of the resource has to be equal to the interest rate, which here is assumed to be 0. So there's over-extraction because the politician over-discount the future. And you can do some comparative statistics. And I'm going to go very quickly. I'm going to just do one comparative statistic, which is about a permanent resource boom. So you increase by 1% prices today and tomorrow. What's going to happen? You're going to reduce the extraction rate and increase extraction efficiency. But at the same time, you're going to have increased patronage because the value of staying of power is increased, and therefore there are more incentives to buy the political process, and therefore, for that reason, the politician will do that. Because he's going to do that, he's going to be less myopic, and therefore reduce the extraction rate to the point where it's going to be efficient. Okay? So I'm going to just shift that on. Okay. Now, the effect of this on a natural resource curve, you have to compute the national income or the wealth, the two-period income, and this is given by this expression. Of course, given that guys in the public sector are less productive than in the private sector, the more you get them into the public sector, the more you reduce private output, and you have the resource wealth here, okay? So now if you look at what will be the effect of a change, a permanent change in the price of the resource, then you have three effects. The first one, which is just the value effect, that if the price goes up, of course, everything else equal, the value of the wealth of the resource is going to go up. The stock, the value of the natural stock of the resource is going to go up. Then you have two other effects. This is the positive extraction effect, which is actually telling you that because now the boom leads the politician to reduce over-extraction, is going to get closer to the efficient path of extraction, the alternate path of extraction, and therefore that's good for output. And then finally you have the negative part, which is, of course, the negative allocation effect of clientelism. And the stronger is the negative part, the more likely you get resource curves. And what you can show in this model is that if you look for the sensitivity of the probability of re-election to patronage, the higher is this sensitivity, the more likely you get actually a resource curve. That is, the weaker are the institutions, the more likely you have a resource curve. The stronger are the institutions and less subject to clientelism, the less likely you have a resource curve. Okay. So now we're going to get to this extension where I introduce in the second period some volatility and assume that the price in the second period has a mean and some kind of stochastic shock with the variance here, sigma square. And let me also give some kind of very quick micro foundations of this political process that generates the probability to be re-election depends on the amount of patronage that the incumbent gives today. So for that, I'm going to have two groups of individuals, size 1/2, two politicians, one for each group. It's a partisan type of politics, and two different types of preferences for private goods and public good. I'm going to assume that group A has a group-specific public good, while group B has not. So that the preferences look like this. For our voters of group A, he cares about his private good, but he cares also about the provision of the public good, and this quadratic term with gamma A suggests that he has actually some risk aversion about fiscal policy volatility. The second group doesn't care about the public good, because this is a public good that is group specific and is only risk neutral. You could make it actually also caring about some public good. The important issue here is that there's an asymmetry between the two constituencies. And of course, because of this nonlinearity, we're going to have some effects of volatility on voters' perceptions. Now, politicians care about their own utilities in the standard way. And you can basically plot the same model as before, except that you need to take care of the resource, the constraint, the budget constraints, assuming that you have no taxes, and that here the resource is paying an exogenous flow of income, P1 and P2 in second period. So those are the budget constraints of the government, knowing that when the incumbent is re-elected, he has to pay for the wages of his clientele, while the challenger does not, because the challenger has no commitment to his clients. This is the idea about clientelism. And then the probabilistic voting model is simply that people decide to support particular agents depending on two components: their economic welfare, whether this is A or B which is elected, and some sort of ideological component, which is one idiosyncratic to the voter, another one which is specific to the incumbent. And we assume those shocks to be uniformly distributed just to get linear expressions. Now, the timing is very interesting here to get my results. In first period, the incumbent will choose his policies, knowing that in the second period, if he's elected, he's going to choose optimally his policies, and similarly for the challenger. Now, in the second period, what I'm going to assume is that the politician has no way to just ensure fully the voters against volatility shocks on fiscal policies. He's limited. And one way to do that is simply assume that he's committed to spend some rents today for himself or invest into a product that gives him some rents. And then when the shocks is realized, then the budget constraint binds, and whatever remains has to be fed into the public good provision. This is what I'm going to do. So you can solve the model backward. And when you do that, basically what you get is that you can show what will be the optimal, the equilibrium elections in this model. You have to compute what will be the expected utility of voters if a politician of type A is elected, if a politician of type B is elected, whether those guys are working in the private sector or they're working in the public sector in the first period. If they're working in the private sector, basically guys of type B don't care who's going to be elected because anyway, they're going to be just receiving their private income and no public good provision. If a guy of type A is elected, then people of, well, voters of type A care. They care because when their own guy is elected, they receive the public provision of the good they like, but of course, they're going to suffer the fiscal volatility associated to price volatility of the resource. So there's a trade-off for them. On average, they gain more, but they suffer some risk. Now, I'm going to assume that the average is larger than the risk, so that they still prefer to be with some people of the same type in power. Now, the other feature is that when you are into the guys who are public employees, the clients of the incumbent in the first period, those guys, actually they care, not only because of the provision of the public good, but also they care because if they get, if the second period, the challenger is elected, they will not be they won't have access to the favors of their patron. And therefore they have to return and work for the private sector. While otherwise they will receive the higher public wage, so they're going to receive some rents. That, if you put it together into some kind of probabilistic voting model and look for what is the support among those different guys to support the politician, then you get to a probability of re-election that looks like this. And this probability of re-election depends on two terms. The first one is that it depends positively on public employment of the clients, and more so when the wage difference between the public sector and the private sector is large. This is the amount of rents that those guys receive inefficiently to make sure that they are patronage. And it depends as well negatively on the volatility of the resource because of this fluctuation of public good provision. And those guys are risk averse, so they don't like this, and they reduce the support of the person that's going to provide that kind of public good to them. You can put that together into what will be then the effective level of public good provision of the politician in the first period, and his level of patronage, manipulation of the political system. And what you get at the end is simply that the volatility effect can affect the equilibrium level of patronage in two channels. The first channel is going to reduce the value of staying in power if the politician himself is concerned about the volatility, right? But on the other hand, remember that patronage means I'm going to have to pay that kind of resource rent to my clients if I am in power. Now, given that the volatility effect reduces political support, I'm going to be less often in power. So I don't care about giving that to those guys right now, because tomorrow I might not be there to give it again. And that stimulates, therefore, patronage policies through the volatility effect. In general, therefore, the effect is ambiguous, but we can show in this model that for reasonable parameter configurations, the negative effect outweighs the positive one. And therefore, that we have a resource curse of the volatility through this patronage mechanism. Now, the model can be extended to various situations. I don't have time to go through that, but where you can introduce public investment. If you introduce public investment, then public investment and patronage will go in opposite direction. More public investment makes it more costly to provide patronage jobs, because when public investment is made, then actually you're going to increase the productivity, the alternative cost to buy those guys out of the private sector. So when you want to provide patronage, you tend to reduce public investment. And this effect, in turn, will make sure that when you look at the shock, so I'm going to go through it, of the price volatility, then different phenomena can come up. On the political patronage side, higher volatility makes political turnover increasing, reducing the horizon of the politician, and therefore stimulating patronage. On the other side, as I said, it reduces the value to stay in power, but for public investment, it's going to go the same way. Political turnover will tend to reduce as well the benefits of having public investment that's going to be provided in the future, and eventually not for me, but for the next politician. And therefore, what you get is that volatility effect going through this political mechanism is tending to be magnified both on the good policies that are reduced and the bad policies that are increased. So at the end of the day, you're going to get a volatility curse. Now, the model can be extended to optimal extraction of the resource. I'm not going to go through that. The only thing that comes up is that as well in that case, an increase in volatility price in the future is going to make the extraction incentives of the incumbent politician even higher than what should be optimal from an efficiency point of view, and therefore will even distort more the reallocation of resources in the economy. Okay, so I guess I'm going to get quickly to the conclusions. My conclusions are what? What do we get from this kind of models? Well, those kinds of models tell us the following things, is that if we believe that volatility prices have an effect on public budget constraints, and therefore on public policies. And we believe that actually the institutional context is such that politicians cannot insure completely their voters against that. So at the end of the day, voters will be a residual claimant to some extent on the risk of volatility prices, and therefore for fiscal volatility. That's going to affect the support they're going to provide to politicians. In turn, that's going to feed back on the way politicians are going to design policies. And very often, they will be going in the direction of designing policies that are wrong from the point of view of social efficiency. Now, of course, that model is very specific. You can extend it into different dimensions. You can think about actual extensions where you introduce market frictions in capital markets, or you introduce debt, so you're going to get some overborrowing, and not other public policies, trade policies, so you're going to get eventually some closing of the economy, and eventually also what are the incentives, the political incentives to maintain the real exchange rate at a certain level that might not be optimal from the point of view of policymaking. I'm going to stop here.
So I have time. I understand we are standing here before you and lunch, so so let's make a couple of questions, and then at lunch people can ask more if they want, or maybe later on.
Very nice talk. I don't know which life you had correspond to this paper, but it's very, very nice. So I wonder what would happen if you could tax the private sector. So you're distorting decisions and using very productive guys in the private sector, in the public sector, paying larger weights to them. You could somehow penalize a politician that does that through an effect of reducing the amount of taxes collected in the private sector. So suppose they could charge, a rate on whatever wage a guy gets in the private sector. By taking this decision of, moving these guys to public jobs where they're more inefficient would impose a cost on them. And they could use this, revenues on taxes to implement cash transfers programs, for instance, and get reelected over and over, as we see here in Brazil, for instance. So I'm not sure how, the introduction of taxes in a certain way would not penalize the politician who takes wrong decisions.
Yeah, I think that the point here is that you can use taxes. But the question is, if the challenger can use taxes exactly the same way as you can, then that doesn't provide you any political advantage. The point about clientelism is that you can have access to some specific mechanism, whether through commitments, social networks, or reputation, with specific guys that allows you to provide favors that the other guy will not be able to do. And this is the mechanism. If you introduce any kind of other instrument that can be used credibly as efficiently by the challenger and the incumbent, by any politician, then for incumbents, doesn't matter.
What I mean is that it's a commitment device.
It's a commitment.
So you're committing yourself to not distort the location, and then you should be closer to first pass.
Okay, so then in that case...
It's not about competition, political competition. It's about being a commitment device.
Yeah, it's a commitment device. No, if you have an institution that is committing you to do that, for sure you kill clientelism. So in that case, the mechanism is shut down. Now, what is interesting, just to mention that point, is that there have been some studies done on Brazil looking at municipalities in Brazil, those that receive old windfalls and those that did not. There's this recent paper by Brolo, Tabellini, Perotti, a third woman, Nancy, I think, where they were comparing, using some discontinuity regression design, how municipalities receiving oil windfalls differ in terms of probability of re-election of incumbents, in terms of public sector employment, from those that didn't receive the windfall. And what they found is that it tends to, a 10% increase in the windfall tends to increase by 7% the probability expected from their models of re-election of the incumbent, as well as increasing public wages and public sector employment in the municipality. So it just suggests that actually this kind of mechanism may be at work. And typically, of course, I'm sure that hasn't been done, but if you start to correlate that with level of corruption, it has been done somehow, as well for Brazilian municipalities. But the two have not been put together yet completely, convincingly, that actually it's going to be even stronger in those places where, presumably, clientelistic relationships are stronger.
So I have a question about the pre-salt that there's a huge resource. We're starting to dig into it now. And given our history of patronage and clientelism, I mean, perhaps from welfare of the country point of view, it would be best to take these resources and improve education, etc., and other externalities. But so what do you think is going to be the outcome with those resources here?
My guess is that, well, of course, the idea that you want to have a national resource fund is a natural idea and advice that an economist will provide to a politician. He will say, look what you can get badly done with those resources. Why don't you try to create an institution that allows you to commit not to do it badly, and typically a national resource fund. And there, the devil is in the details. How actually still politicians can manipulate what is inside the resource fund or not. Of course, everybody has in mind the case of Norway, but even Norway, somehow, if you talk to Norwegian economists, they tell you it's not as clear as it is, but it's for Norway. Okay, it works pretty well in Norway because also the political system in Norway is working maybe much more efficiently than some other places where political institutions are weaker. So I think that, okay, the right answer will be yes, you should certainly create a national resource fund that invests in education massively. But then how do you monitor that politically and make sure that people, when they invest in the resource, that resource will not be recaptured somehow in the future by the next guy that's in power, indirectly. So private sector involvement can be, of course, part of the answer. Some additional, like in Chile, they have this rule for the way they stabilize, they look at policies to stabilize volatility of prices that is based on a bunch of experts. Or you may do it as in Alaska. You say, give the money, lump sum to every